The desert wind carried dust like smoke across the ridges above Bizerte on May 12, 1943. Trucks lay rusting in the sun, their tanks dry. Horses collapsed beside shattered artillery, their harnesses cut. For Hans Keller, a 23-year-old gunner of the 10th Panzer Division, it was not the sound of battle that haunted him, but the silence. White cloths fluttered on rifles across the hills. The Afrika Korps had surrendered. Columns of German and Italian soldiers shuffled down the slopes. Their uniforms were bleached by months of sun, their faces gaunt. Keller caught the stink of sweat and burned oil. Word spread in mutters. More than 250,000 Axis troops captured in Tunisia. Whole divisions, 10th Panzer, 21st Panzer, 90 Leichte, gone in an afternoon. He remembered the old Prussian tales of holding against impossible odds. This, he realized bitterly, was not a tale of valor, but arithmetic. By the time British armor rolled into Tunis, Keller's battery had been down to a few shells. Supply columns had been pounded into dust by Allied aircraft. Fuel was so scarce that they dragged their 10.5-centimeter LEFH howitzers with horses. When the animals died, the men carried ammunition on their backs. Germany's craftsmanship meant nothing when the warehouses were empty. Now he was herded toward the coast under the rifles of young Americans. They looked casual, chewing gum, weapons oiled and polished. They did not swagger like conquerors. They looked like farm boys who had inherited the battlefield simply because their nation could afford to send them here. Keller's pride stung at the ease of it. At the docks, the shock deepened. Crates stenciled U.S. Army rose in towers higher than the warehouses. Coffee, flour, tires, medicine, mountains of supplies waiting to be shipped. The sight wounded him more than any shell. Germany starved for rubber and fuel, while the enemy treated abundance as routine. The ship assigned to them looked ungainly, its welded sides slab-like, as if punched from a mold. A guard grinned and translated Roosevelt's name for it. A real ugly duckling. It was a Liberty ship, mass-produced by the hundreds. Later, Keller would learn the impossible statistic. 2,710 launched in 4 years, nearly 3 every 2 days. Germany could not have matched that pace with all its yards combined. The hold reeked of salt and sweat, but even here the contrast continued. At night, a Navy cook ladled stew into tin cups, thick, hot, filling. Alongside came slices of white bread and mugs of strong coffee. Keller chewed slowly, remembering the barley gruel and sawdust bread of the front. Guards ate the same food, no better and no worse. America fed even its captives better than the Reich fed its soldiers. On deck, Keller saw the convoy forming. Liberty ships, freighters, and gray warships prowling like shepherd dogs. The Atlantic stretched immense and calm. U-boats that once haunted the seas seemed already defeated. He leaned on the rail, breathing diesel smoke, and wondered how many such convoys crossed these waters every month. If this one carried only prisoners, what filled the others? Tanks, planes, more food than Germany could dream of. That night, the engine throbbed below like a steel heartbeat. Keller lay on his bunk, listening to men murmur in the dark. He felt the last illusions crumbling. Rommel's genius, German discipline, the pride of the Wehrmacht, all seemed meaningless against this tide of industry. The ugly duckling carried him westward, not just into captivity, but into revelation. Somewhere across the ocean lay America, a country he had imagined through propaganda posters and half-believed stories. Soon he would walk its soil and understand a truth more devastating than any defeat in the desert. Germany could never compete with America's factories. The Liberty ship smelled of steel and paint, as though the yard that had birthed it still clung to its hull. When Hans Keller shuffled up the gangway, guarded on both sides by young Americans, he thought the vessel looked unfinished, almost crude. Its sides were welded flat, no rivets in sight, its silhouette blocky against the Mediterranean sun. It seemed impossible that something so inelegant could survive the Atlantic. A guard smirked as if reading his thoughts. Ugly duckling, he said in slow German, tapping the hull. Keller would later discover the scale of this ugliness. 2,710 Liberty ships built in less than 4 years, nearly 3 launched every 2 days. Germany, with all its vaunted engineering, could not have dreamed of such a pace. Below decks, the hold stretched like a cavern of bunks stacked 3 high. The air was thick with sweat, sea salt, and oil. Dozens of his comrades muttered prayers or stared blankly into the dark. Yet the shock came not from confinement, but from the food. When night fell, sailors passed down tin cups of stew so hot it steamed in the stale air. White bread, fresh and soft, followed. Bread so different from the black loaves of home, where sawdust and barley stretched the flour. Finally came mugs of coffee strong enough to sting the tongue. Keller sipped carefully, astonished. Even in captivity, they ate better than they had on the front lines. The routine of the ship lulled him. The engine throbbed with a steady rhythm, like the beat of some mechanical heart. Each vibration reminded him of Germany's scarcity, where every liter of fuel had been hoarded, every machine run to failure. Here, power seemed infinite. The ship surged forward with the arrogance of mass production, one unit among thousands, easily replaced if lost. It was an expendable colossus, built not to last forever but to exist long enough to do its job. When the hatches opened for air, Keller climbed onto deck. The view left him mute. A convoy stretched across the horizon, ships in ordered rows, gray destroyers circling like herding dogs. Their decks bristled with guns, barrels swiveling toward unseen threats. He realized that this single convoy carried more steel than entire German armies had commanded in North Africa. The United States could afford to ship prisoners across the ocean in vessels others might have reserved for weapons. The excess was staggering. The sea rolled endlessly, gulls vanished, and days blurred. Occasionally, Keller caught fragments of American conversation. The sailors complained about the coffee, griped about long hours, joked about baseball scores back home. Their casualness bewildered him. They were not fanatics, nor professional soldiers raised on Prussian drill. They were citizens, drafted or volunteering, carried here on a tide of production so vast that it had turned farmers and mechanics into the wardens of empire. Storms struck midway across, waves slammed against the hull, and men in the hold vomited into buckets. Keller clung to his bunk as the ship rolled, yet the Liberty ship held firm, groaning but unbroken. Its welded seams did not leak. Its ungainly shape rode the seas with brute determination. He realized the design was not beautiful, but practical. Steel plates cut in pieces any yard could handle, assembled by workers who had never seen a ship before the war. Mass production, not craftsmanship, had conquered the ocean. One morning, he glimpsed an escort vessel firing depth charges. The thumps reverberated through the sea, but no torpedo came. By 1943, America was producing ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The statistics would later confirm what Keller intuited on that deck. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned, not through individual skill, but through relentless mathematics. Convoys like his no longer sailed in fear, they sailed in inevitability. Days later, the sky brightened with the hazy line of a coastline. Guards pointed silently toward the horizon. Keller felt his heart tighten. This was not France, not North Africa. This was America itself. The place had been a rumor in his youth, a distant land of factories and skyscrapers whispered about with equal envy and contempt. Now it stood before him, real and immense, waiting to swallow him into captivity. He leaned against the rail, breathing diesel smoke and salt air, and tried to imagine what lay inland. If the ships alone numbered in the thousands, what of the factories that produced them? If prisoners like him merited convoys this large, what did American soldiers receive? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, each carrying the same answer. Germany could never compete. As the Liberty ship cut into the harbor, Keller realized that the journey across the Atlantic was more than transport. It was initiation. Every creak of steel and every engine throb had been a lesson. This ungainly vessel, mass-produced and dismissively called ugly, represented a force beyond any battlefield victory. For the first time, Keller understood that the Reich had been doomed not in the sands of Tunisia, but in the shipyards of America. The train yard at Hampton Roads thundered with life as Keller stumbled down the gangway. The smell of tar, coal smoke, and salt water mixed in the damp Virginia air. He blinked at the sight before him. Lines of track vanishing into the distance, switch engines clanking, whistles shrieking in every direction. The Liberty ship's hold had seemed vast, but here the scale dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. Crates stenciled U.S. Army stood stacked like fortresses along the pier, and beyond them a forest of boxcars waited with open doors. He had been told America was big. Nothing in Europe prepared him for this. Even the port seemed less like a dockyard and more like a machine, its gears made of steel rails and freight cars, its pistons, the locomotives, belching steam. A sergeant barked in English, and the column of prisoners was prodded forward toward the waiting trains. Guards with rifles moved alongside, but Keller noticed their casual posture. They did not need menace. The overwhelming logistics were menace enough. Private Jimmy O'Rourke, 19 years old and barely a year removed from Brooklyn, leaned on his rifle as he watched the prisoners shuffle past. He was struck by how thin they looked, skin stretched tight on cheekbones, uniforms sagging from weight loss. His own duffel was heavy with clean clothes, rations, even extra socks mailed from his mother. He almost pitied them, until he remembered they had once fought to overrun Europe. Still, it was hard to look at them and feel fear. The prisoners were guided toward rows of Pullman-style cars, far more comfortable than they expected. Keller hesitated, wondering if this was some trick, but a guard waved him in. Inside, padded benches lined the walls. Windows opened to the humid air. He thought of the cattle wagons that had carried conscripts to the front in Germany, of the endless days in dark compartments with straw on the floor. Here, even prisoners rode in passenger cars. The train lurched forward, wheels screeching, and the convoy of POWs began its inland journey. Through the window, Keller saw endless sidings, each filled with freight cars. Coal hoppers by the hundred, tank cars glinting in the sun, flat cars loaded with jeeps under tarps. The procession never seemed to end. In Germany, such a concentration of rolling stock would have been guarded like treasure. Here, it appeared routine, almost careless. Jimmy dozed against the window, the rhythm of the rails familiar and comforting. He had grown up riding the subway, but this was different. He could feel the power of the locomotive pulling dozens of cars without strain. He thought of what the sergeant had said in training. America's rail network stretched over 200,000 miles. No enemy could sever it. No bombing campaign could hope to cripple it all. The system was too vast, too redundant. That was their advantage. While Germany obsessed over tanks, America obsessed over connections. Keller pressed his forehead against the glass. Fields and towns slipped past, wooden houses with wide porches, children waving as the train roared through. He smelled damp earth and pine when the windows opened. After months of desert dust, the green was almost painful to his eyes. He wondered how many factories hid beyond those ridges, how many silos and depots. Even here, hundreds of miles from the front, the country seemed mobilized for war. The train stopped briefly at a junction, and through the window, Keller glimpsed another troop train pulling alongside. Inside, young American soldiers in fresh uniforms laughed, smoked, and shared sandwiches from paper bags. They waved at the guards escorting the Germans. Keller's stomach twisted. These were replacements, boys still soft with youth, yet bound for the front. Germany had no such reserves. His division in Tunisia had been filled with worn veterans, men dragged from one disaster to the next. Here the enemy seemed endless, renewed with every trainload. As the train clattered southward again, Keller tried to calculate. If each siding held hundreds of cars, if each train carried hundreds of men, how many in a day? How many in a month? He remembered hearing that 30,000 prisoners could be shipped each month to America. If they had space for so many captives, what capacity did they have for their own forces? The numbers grew monstrous in his mind, overwhelming, impossible. Night fell, and lanterns swung in the corridors. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat and coal smoke, but the rhythm of the wheels never faltered. For Keller, each mile of track was another nail in the coffin of Germany's war. No speech by Goebbels, no promise of miracle weapons could compete with this simple fact. The Americans had built a rail empire to carry armies as easily as passengers. When dawn came, Keller woke to see the train rolling past endless forests. The whistle blew, long and low, echoing across the hills. He realized then that the journey was not merely to a camp. It was an education. Every siding, every yard, every clattering wheel was a lesson in power. Germany had believed in discipline and tradition. America believed in movement, and movement, Keller now understood, would win the war. The train screeched to a halt in a cloud of steam and cinders, its whistle echoing through the thick summer air. When the doors opened, Hans Keller stepped down into heat that wrapped around him like a wet blanket. The sun above Alabama was heavy and merciless, and the ground beneath his boots was clay the color of dried blood. Cicadas shrilled from the trees, a chorus so loud it seemed to vibrate in his skull. After months of desert wind and the rolling Atlantic, the air here felt dense, swollen with humidity. He had never known a place could feel so alive. Ahead stretched rows of wooden barracks, already weathered though freshly built. Guard towers watched over high fences strung with barbed wire. This was Camp Aliceville, one of hundreds scattered across America. Built in less than 6 months on farmland near the Tombigbee River, it could house 6,000 men. For Keller and the others, it looked permanent, solid, and efficient. The Reich had called America decadent. Here, decadence wore the face of discipline. The prisoners were marched through the gates, boots sinking into soft red earth. The heat made sweat bead instantly on their foreheads, and dust clung to their uniforms. Guards moved them along with clipped English commands. To Keller's surprise, the first stop was a medical tent. Doctors in clean coats checked their eyes, ears, teeth. They noted infections, gave injections, even handed out soap. Keller felt humiliation mix with relief. In Tunisia, the wounded had been abandoned. Here, the enemy's prisoners received treatment as if they mattered. Private Jimmy O'Rourke leaned against a post, watching the column shuffle into camp. He had been assigned here after escort duty from Virginia. The prisoners looked stunned by everything: the humidity, the barracks, the discipline of the guards. Jimmy grinned when he overheard one mutter about bread. The camp kitchen was already baking soft loaves, white and fluffy. For the Germans, used to coarse black bread or worse, it was a revelation. He shook his head. They looked at Wonder Bread like it was gold. Inside the camp, Keller's barracks smelled of pine boards and fresh paint. The bunks were lined neatly with blankets. At the end of each row stood a potbelly stove, though in the heat it seemed absurd. Screens on the windows kept out insects, another small miracle. The men dropped their gear and stared, too exhausted to speak. Even captivity was orderly here. Later that afternoon, Keller was marched to the PX, the prisoner canteen. He expected rations of gruel and water. Instead, shelves displayed cigarettes, chocolate bars, even stationery and playing cards. With the small allowance issued to them, prisoners could purchase comforts. The guards explained through translators. The Geneva Convention required fair treatment, and America followed it to the letter. Keller had heard propaganda claiming Americans tortured captives. Now he stood in front of a shelf of Hershey bars. The Reich had lied. The shock of abundance unsettled him more than the sight of rifles. He remembered comrades in Tunisia chewing dry biscuits stretched with sawdust. He remembered officers hoarding the last tins of meat. And here he was, a defeated soldier, holding a bar of chocolate wrapped in shiny paper. He bit into it slowly, tasting sugar on his tongue, and felt a strange twist of grief. That evening, as the sun dropped, Cicadas gave way to frogs croaking from the marshes. The air cooled slightly, and smoke rose from the kitchens. Keller sat on a bench, chewing meat stew ladled from an enamel cup. It was not gourmet, but it was plentiful, and no one went hungry. The guards ate the same. He could not escape the comparison. Germany rationing every crust, America feeding prisoners as if supply were infinite. Jimmy walked past, rifle slung loosely, and saw the prisoners staring at their plates. He thought about the Army's warehouses stacked with food. The waste alone, he knew, could have supplied an entire German division, but to him it was normal. To them, it was unimaginable. As night fell, Keller lay on his bunk, listening to the creak of wood and the hum of insects outside. He thought of the promises German leaders had made, that discipline and willpower could overcome shortages, that quality could defeat quantity. Yet here, in the red clay of Alabama, surrounded by food, medicine, and comfort, he saw the truth written plainly. America had so much that it extended even to its enemies. Germany had nothing left but slogans. The cicadas started again, their relentless song filling the darkness. Keller closed his eyes and realized that his war had ended, but his education had just begun. Colonel William T. Everett straightened the papers on his desk at Camp Aliceville, his pen moving briskly across another report. To him, the war was measured not in shells fired or medals won, but in columns of figures. How many prisoners processed? How many meals served? How many man-hours of labor accounted for? On June 3, 1943, the day after the first Germans arrived, he checked the ledger and saw it matched perfectly. Trains on schedule, barracks filled, kitchens functioning, 6,000 beds ready. For Everett, that precision was victory. Across the yard, Hans Keller stood in line for roll call. The air was already hot, though the sun had barely risen, and the red clay clung to his boots. He tried not to think of the endless columns of numbers that must exist to make this place possible. Supplies tallied, trains dispatched, rations calculated down to the ounce. America did not merely fight with soldiers, it fought with ledgers. Later that morning, he was marched with others into the work detail office. Translators explained the rules. Prisoners could volunteer for farm labor or camp construction, earning small wages to spend at the canteen. Keller nodded silently, though what caught his eye was the stack of forms on the desk, each one stamped, filed, cataloged. Even captivity was organized with ruthless efficiency. That afternoon, he wandered past the PX, where prisoners lined up for cigarettes and chocolate. He bought a packet of Lucky Strikes with the small credit he had been issued. The paper felt crisp between his fingers, the smoke harsh in his lungs. He remembered the hollow taste of German ersatz tobacco, cut with leaves and bark. Here, even the luxuries of prisoners surpassed what soldiers at the front had received. Colonel Everett walked the camp that evening, inspecting the perimeter. He nodded to guards, checked towers, made notes about drainage ditches. He was not a man of speeches or rhetoric. He believed in systems. The office of the Provost Marshal General had given him precise instructions, and he carried them out without deviation. That was the American way, not improvisation but planning. And unlike Germany, the plans could be backed by limitless material. Keller sat outside his barracks, watching the guards joke with each other. They seemed young, barely trained, yet utterly confident. Their rifles were well-oiled, their uniforms fresh. He thought of German recruits back home, dressed in patched clothing, drilling with wooden rifles before real weapons could be issued. The disparity was humiliating. When mail arrived, Keller saw comrades receiving Red Cross parcels, coffee, sugar, sometimes even small cans of meat. Letters from home described bombings in Stuttgart, shortages of bread, families huddled in cellars. Here he ate better as a prisoner than his own parents did as civilians. He lit another Lucky Strike and stared at the smoke rising into the humid air, wondering how long before Germany itself collapsed under hunger. That night in the mess hall, he spooned thick stew into his mouth and heard the statistics whispered among prisoners. America held over 371,000 German soldiers on its soil, with camps scattered across 46 states. By May 1945, the number would reach 425,000 Axis captives. The sheer geography of it boggled the mind. How could one country manage so many? Yet Everett's ledgers showed how. Every train documented, every ration counted, every prisoner accounted for. Jimmy O'Rourke, now assigned to kitchen guard duty, watched as POWs filed out with trays. He shook his head at their awe. To him, white bread and meat were ordinary. He had grown up during the Depression, but even then, his mother had stretched meals from canned goods and flour bought at corner stores. Now the Army gave him 3 meals a day, more than he could eat. To see enemies gape at leftovers felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Everett closed his nightly report with satisfaction. Another 3,000 prisoners processed nationwide today, added to the total. No escapes, no shortages, no disorder. He signed his name and filed the papers, knowing they would vanish into Washington's archives. His war would never be recorded in medals or monuments, but in numbers that told a story more decisive than any battle. America could capture entire armies, house them comfortably, feed them generously, and never strain its resources. Keller returned to his bunk, the cicadas loud outside, and thought about those numbers. To the Americans, they were paperwork. To him, they were proof that Germany's fate was sealed. A nation that could treat its prisoners this well in such staggering numbers was a nation that could not be defeated. He closed his eyes, hearing the sound of guards laughing outside, and felt the weight of inevitability pressing down heavier than the Alabama heat. The first time Hans Keller saw the motor pool at Aliceville, he stopped in his tracks. Beyond the wire fence stretched row upon row of vehicles, parked nose to tail, shimmering in the heat. Trucks, jeeps, ambulances, so many that the lines seemed to run into the horizon. Canvas covers flapped in the summer breeze, and sunlight flashed from windshields like a field of mirrors. For a man who had watched artillery dragged by starving horses in Tunisia, the sight was not just impressive, it was crushing. A guard walking beside him laughed at the prisoner's expressions. "Deuce and a half," he said, patting the hood of one olive-drab monster. Keller heard the term repeated through the ranks until it became a chant. The Americans called them 2.5-ton trucks. The model designation was GMC CCKW, and the numbers were staggering. More than 500,000 had already rolled off production lines, part of a total of 2.4 million trucks procured by the U.S. Army. General Eisenhower himself, the guard explained proudly, had called the deuce and a half one of the 6 most vital weapons of the war. Keller thought of the 88-millimeter guns his comrades revered, weapons of precision and terror. Yet here was proof that trucks, simple, rugged, countless, might be the true deciding factor. Jimmy O'Rourke, assigned to escort a work detail near the pool, watched the Germans gape. To him, the trucks were ordinary, like taxis in New York, everywhere at once. But he could see what the prisoners saw, a logistical machine beyond imagination. He thought of the lectures and training, how convoys of these trucks supplied Patton's divisions as they raced across North Africa. Each vehicle could carry a squad of men or a load of ammunition. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands, and an army could move as if on wheels. Keller leaned against the fence, staring at the sheer repetition. They were not unique like German machines. Each was interchangeable, built to the same pattern, the same bolts, the same tires. If one broke down, another filled its place. If a part failed, spares were stacked in depots by the thousands. He realized that this standardization, so mundane, was a weapon more powerful than any tank ace. Later, as his work detail passed a maintenance yard, Keller saw soldiers replacing an engine in minutes, the hood tilted back like the lid of a toy. Tools clattered, men joked, and soon the truck rumbled to life again. In Germany, repairs often required cannibalizing wrecks or improvising with scraps. Here, maintenance was just another routine, like sharpening pencils. Jimmy lit a cigarette, watching the mechanics. He remembered hearing that at peak, American factories produced trucks faster than the Army could ship them overseas. Some were stacked on ships in layers, driven off ramps in North Africa, as if from a moving garage. It amazed him too, though he had grown used to thinking of abundance as normal. Seeing the prisoner's disbelief reminded him of how extraordinary it really was. Keller thought of Tunisia again, horses foaming in the heat, collapsing under the strain of pulling guns through sand. He remembered carrying shells on his back while Allied aircraft shredded their dwindling supply lines. And now, staring at rows of deuce and a halves, he knew that Germany's defeat had not come from Rommel's missteps or Montgomery's tactics. It had come from this, a motor pool larger than his division. At night in the barracks, he told his comrades what he had learned from a guard. The Americans had built over 800,000 of the 2.5-ton trucks alone. The number seemed unreal, like propaganda, but they had seen the proof with their own eyes. One prisoner muttered that no miracle weapon could balance such scales. Another fell silent, staring into his tin cup, unable to argue. The next day, the work detail marched past again. Keller touched the fence and felt the rough metal of the wire. Beyond, a mechanic revved an engine, the sound deep and steady, like thunder rolling across flatlands. He imagined that sound multiplied 1,000-fold, convoys stretching across continents. That was the music of American power, reliable, endless, implacable. Jimmy adjusted his helmet and looked over the yard one last time. He thought of Eisenhower's words, one of the 6 most vital weapons. Trucks, not glory. Logistics, not legend. He realized that the generals understood what the prisoners were only beginning to grasp. Wars were not won by daring alone, but by supply. As Keller walked back to his barrack, cicadas buzzing in the trees, he knew he had witnessed more than a collection of vehicles. He had seen the future of war. Germany could build Tigers and Panthers, weapons of fearsome reputation, but they would always be too few, too complicated, too late. Against this tide of simple, mass-produced trucks, such machines were already obsolete. The motor pool was a graveyard for illusions, and Keller buried his last one there. The projector flickered, casting jumpy black and white images onto the mess hall wall. Hans Keller sat on a wooden bench between 2 other prisoners, the evening heat thick and unrelenting. Most nights at Camp Aliceville ended in routine, lights out, cicadas, and the groan of the barracks settling into silence. But tonight, the guards had set up a movie reel. Not a Hollywood film, but a documentary, American-made, for internal morale. The guards had laughed, saying, "You boys need to see where this all comes from." The title flashed in bold letters, "Victory Begins at Willow Run." The screen showed a long, gleaming factory, miles of windows, wide roads, conveyors snaking past assembly lines. But it wasn't cars rolling out of these gates. It was bombers, 4-engine B-24 Liberators. Hans's breath caught as the footage rolled on. Wings, engines, fuselages, painted and assembled under one roof. The factory floor buzzed with motion, men and women in overalls working in rhythm, machines pressing and stamping as if the building itself were alive. He whispered the number when it appeared on screen. 650 aircraft per month. 1 bomber every hour. Not in a country, not in an alliance, but in a single factory. The Ford Motor Company had built this place, Willow Run, just outside Detroit. It had never produced aircraft before the war. And yet here it was, flooding the skies with steel birds. Hans thought of the Luftwaffe's proudest bomber, the Heinkel He-177. It had taken years to develop and struggled with technical issues throughout. Germany had produced just over 1,000. Willow Run alone would make more than 8,000 B-24s before the war's end. The room grew quiet. No one mocked the film. No one looked away. Jimmy O'Rourke stood at the back of the hall, leaning against the doorframe. He'd seen the reel before, during his training stateside. Back then, it made him proud. Now, watching the prisoners react, he saw it differently, not with triumph, but with understanding. The realization was settling into their bones. This wasn't just American strength. It was a kind of inevitability. The footage shifted to convoys of trucks delivering aluminum, rubber, fuel. Men working in shifts around the clock. A narrator intoned proudly, "These aircraft will fly supplies to the front, drop bombs on enemy lines, and bring our boys home. The arsenal of democracy never sleeps." Hans clenched his hands. The planes weren't special. Each one looked like the last. There was no signature design flourish, no artistry, just uniformity, mass, the kind of mass that Germany couldn't stop. He remembered Africa, the dwindling Luftwaffe presence. A few Me-109s here and there patched together, running on synthetic fuel. Nothing like this. The camera panned over rows of completed aircraft lined up outside the plant, gleaming like new coins in the sun. Then came the launch footage, bomber after bomber, rolling down the tarmac, lifting into the air, engines thundering like rolling thunder across the plains. Jimmy noticed the shift in the prisoner's posture. There were no murmurs now, just silence, heavy and still. One man crossed himself, another just stared at the floor. Jimmy felt a pang of something close to guilt. When the reel ended, the lights came back on. No one clapped. Hans stood slowly, the images burned into his mind. He didn't speak. None of them did. They filed out into the humid Alabama night, like men walking away from a graveside. Later, in the barracks, someone muttered, "They build in a week what we make in a year." No one contradicted him. Hans lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He remembered the pride of German industry, precision parts, hand-fitted engines, engineers in lab coats. But precision took time Germany no longer had. And now he saw the truth. The Americans didn't need perfect planes. They needed enough planes, and they had them. One factory, 1 hour, one bomber, and behind Willow Run were dozens of other plants. Douglas, Boeing, consolidated. Each with their own assembly lines, each feeding the sky. It wasn't about one great pilot or one brilliant general. It was about system, scale, and speed. In that moment, Hans understood why the front in Russia was collapsing, why the Reich's final victory had become a whisper. You could train a sniper, you could build a Tiger tank, but you couldn't outmatch a nation that built bombers like loaves of bread. The cicadas screamed outside, but he didn't hear them. All he could see was the factory floor, the endless rows of machines, and the sky filling with planes. The air smelled like cut corn and diesel fuel. Hans Keller stepped off the back of the army truck and into a landscape so vast it made the African desert seem intimate. This was Iowa, late summer 1944, and the sky stretched so wide it could swallow whole divisions. His work detail had been sent north from Camp Aliceville to help with the harvest. American farmers faced labor shortages, and German POWs were the answer. That, too, felt like a kind of defeat, being useful to the enemy's abundance. Rows of corn, golden and dense, rustled in the wind. A red tractor rumbled in the distance, followed by a combine that sucked grain into its maw like a machine possessed. Hans had never seen one in operation. In Germany, much of the work was still done by hand or horse. Here, the machines did not just assist the harvest, they commanded it. A woman stood by the farmhouse porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her name was Anna Mae Johnson. Her husband was serving in the Pacific, and the government had assigned her 3 POWs to help bring in the season's yield. She regarded them not with fear, but with measured curiosity. They looked tired, sunburned, more boys than monsters. She poured water from a steel jug into tin cups. "Hot one," she said, not expecting a reply. Only Hans understood her, and he nodded once, grateful. The water was cold enough to make his teeth ache. He drank in silence, watching the machinery grind through another acre. The work began at dawn and ended at dusk. They hoisted sacks, loaded trailers, stacked bushels. Keller marveled at the rhythm of it all. Trucks arrived like clockwork. Elevators lifted the grain into towering silos. Even the tools were standardized. Handles the same length, wagons the same width. No improvisation, no scrounging for parts. Nothing like home. Anna May watched them from the kitchen window, her apron flecked with flour. She'd grown used to the rumble of the grain dryer, the clatter of moving belts. But what struck her most was the look on the German's face. Keller, they called him. Not just sweat and fatigue, wonder. He looked at the machinery like it was sorcery, like he couldn't believe such abundance could be real. At lunch, she brought sandwiches and jars of lemonade. The German sat under a tree, grateful for the shade. Hans peeled back the wax paper and stared at the thick slices of meat, the soft bread, the fresh apple on the side. He took a bite and closed his eyes. It tasted like peace. One of the guards chuckled as he lit a cigarette. "Can't believe we're feeding them better than they fed their own army." Hans heard him, but didn't flinch. The man wasn't wrong. That evening, after the last trailer was filled, Keller stood beside the grain elevator and listened to its roar. The corn rose through the chute, up and up, vanishing into a concrete silo. He stared at the capacity stenciled on its side. 250,000 bushels, one farm, one harvest. He thought of Germany's bread lines, of bombed rail stations, of mothers boiling turnips and powdered milk. He thought of the Reich's calls for sacrifice, for endurance. And here was a farm with enough grain to feed a regiment for a year, and most of it, Anna May had told them, would be sold for profit. In the quiet after the machinery shut down, Anna May brought out coffee. She poured a cup for Hans and sat beside him on the porch steps, the guard watching from a distance. The stars blinked awake overhead, sharp and clean in the Iowa night. "You ever see anything like this back home?" she asked. Hans shook his head. "Not like this." She nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd long suspected. "We got a lot. Sometimes too much. But I'm glad it helps end the war faster." He said nothing. He didn't know what to say. That night, lying on a cot in the barn, Hans stared into the rafters. The machines, the silos, the trucks, they weren't weapons, but they were more powerful than bombs. He realized now that the war would not be won by generals, but by farmers, by people like Anna May, who could summon abundance from soil with steel and sunlight. Germany had made much of its scientists and its soldiers. But what Keller had seen today, this harvest of plenty, felt more decisive than any Panzer breakthrough. The war wasn't just being lost in Berlin. It was being lost here, in Iowa, one bushel at a time. The garbage bins behind the Aliceville mess hall were always full by nightfall. Hans Keller had noticed it early on, but he hadn't understood the scale until his work detail was assigned to sanitation duty. That afternoon, standing beside rows of bulging metal barrels, he stared into an open bin and felt something tighten in his chest. Half a tray of mashed potatoes, bread crusts, apple cores, sausages with one bite taken. Someone had tossed out a whole sandwich, not spoiled, just unwanted. His hands trembled as he held the lid. In Germany, such waste would have been unthinkable. Families rinsed jam jars for boiling water. Restaurants served turnip broth and called it stew. On the front, rations were stretched to the gram. Black bread, thin soup, and sometimes, on good days, a few slices of meat. Here, Keller saw soldiers throwing food away on purpose. He turned as one of the guards walked past, chewing a stick of gum. Private Jimmy O'Rourke glanced into the barrel and shrugged. "Happens every day," he said. "They send us more than we can eat." Hans blinked. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. More than we can eat. The detail moved down the line, replacing liners, washing out bins with hoses. The smell wasn't foul. It was too fresh for that. It smelled like lunch. It smelled like victory. Jimmy leaned against the mess wall, watching the Germans work. He thought about how normal it all seemed. Waste, surplus, rotation. The Army supply chain sent food whether they needed it or not. The motto was clear: better to have too much than risk having too little. He remembered a lecture in logistics school. In 1944 alone, The United States had produced 2.7 billion cans of field rations. That year, U.S. agriculture had yielded enough wheat, corn, and meat to feed not just its own troops, but also Britain, the Free French, and much of the civilian population of liberated Europe. In just 1 week of 1944, American bakeries had shipped more bread to the front lines than Germany's entire monthly civilian output. Jimmy watched Keller hesitate over another bin. "You okay?" he asked. Hans nodded, but his voice was distant. "We rationed bread crusts," he said, "and this you throw away." Jimmy didn't know how to respond, so he just said, "It's just garbage, man." But to Hans, it was more than garbage. It was a symbol. A system that could afford to waste this much could never be starved into surrender. Waste, in America, was not failure. It was proof of success. Later that evening, Keller walked past the camp laundry and saw clean uniforms being folded by enlisted men. Dozens of shirts, piles of socks, fresh towels. He thought of his brother, still fighting on the Eastern Front, wearing the same pair of boots for 2 winters. Thought of his cousin who'd been killed in the siege of Leningrad, where even rats had become food. At the PX, he bought a chocolate bar and a tin of shaving cream. A guard offered him change and added with a grin, "Need anything else?" "Got soap, too. You guys love the soap." Keller forced a smile, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He remembered Speer's voice, recorded from a radio address months before capture, promising that Germany's scientific precision would outlast the crude weight of Allied industry. But now he saw the truth. This wasn't crude. It was overwhelming. In the barracks that night, someone passed around a tattered copy of Stars and Stripes. A table caught Keller's eye. Aircraft production, year by year. The numbers jumped off the page. In 1944, America had produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, just over 40,000. He remembered the Willow Run footage, 1 bomber an hour. A fellow prisoner muttered, "They have so much, they don't even count it." And Keller realized that was true. Germany counted everything, every bullet, every uniform, every drop of fuel. Here, they lost count because the numbers became meaningless. And yet, the machine never stopped. Jimmy came by as lights out approached. "Tomorrow's your last sanitation shift," he said. Hans looked up from his bunk. "You throw out more than we ever had." Jimmy gave a lopsided grin. "Yeah, I guess we do." When the lights dimmed and the night sounds took over, the cicadas, the distant engines, the soft hum of the Alabama summer, Keller lay awake, not from shame and not from anger, but from clarity. The war wasn't being won by strategy or superior soldiers. It was being won by abundance, by a nation that produced more than it needed and then gave the rest away, or threw it out. It wasn't just America's strength that had broken Germany. It was its excess. Hans Keller sat on a wooden bench outside the camp chapel, watching the sun sink behind the wire fence. A warm breeze carried the scent of pine and machine oil, the ever-present perfume of Camp Aliceville. Across the yard, a Red Cross volunteer handed out newspapers, old copies of the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Stars and Stripes. Hans took one without a word, unfolding it like a relic. The headline didn't surprise him. U.S. War Production Peaks, 1944, Shatters All Records. What did surprise him was the insert, a centerfold chart, glossy and precise, mapping out the breadth of American military production over the last 12 months. Tanks, planes, ships, bullets, boots, all measured, counted, compared. For the first time, Hans saw the full scope laid bare. He counted the numbers out loud, his voice low. In 1944 alone, America had built 96,318 aircraft, 28,981 tanks, 8,795 warships, 17 million tons of merchant shipping, 7.6 billion rounds of ammunition, 2.4 million machine guns. Germany, in the same period, had built fewer than half of those numbers, despite every effort, every decree, every promise from Berlin. Hans let the paper rest in his lap. These weren't just numbers, they were death sentences for cities, for dreams, for empires. How could any nation, even one as disciplined and determined as Germany, hope to compete with that? A guard walked by, nodding once. "Hell of a thing, huh?" he said, glancing at the chart. Hans said nothing. What was there to say? Inside the chapel, an American chaplain gave a sermon about deliverance and duty. Hans listened from the steps. The chaplain's voice was calm, assured. "We give thanks," he said, "not only for the bravery of our fighting men, but for the strength of the people behind them. The mothers who work the line, the farmers who fill the ships, the welders who build the fleet. This is not just a war of soldiers. This is a war of citizens." Hans closed his eyes. Germany had trusted its engineers. America had trusted its people. That was the difference. The next morning, Hans joined a detail assigned to inventory captured German equipment at a depot outside Montgomery. The Americans had rows of Panzerfausts, MG-42s, spent shell casings, all labeled, tagged, categorized. He watched as a U.S. officer explained the differences between German and American field gear to a group of fresh recruits. "The Germans make great weapons," the officer said, holding up a Carabiner 98K. "This rifle's accurate, rugged, but it takes time to build. Now here," he lifted an M1 Garand. "This is ours. Semi-automatic, faster rate of fire, mass-produced. We don't need one perfect rifle. We need 1,000,000 good ones." Hans touched the smooth wood of the Garand. In North Africa, they'd feared it. One American squad with Garands could outshoot a platoon of bolt-action rifles, and they had thousands of squads. He remembered a captured U.S. quartermaster report he once read in Tunisia. It had detailed logistics for a single division, 30,000 soldiers. Each man allotted 5 pairs of socks, 3 pairs of boots, 2 winter coats, a razor, and a toothbrush. The report had included a toothbrush schedule, when and how often they would be replaced. He couldn't believe it then. He believed it now. That night, Keller and a few other prisoners were given access to a camp library. He found a worn copy of Life magazine from early 1945. Inside was a photo essay titled "Arsenal of Democracy at Work." One image stopped him cold. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, launching Liberty ships. The caption read, "One new ship every 3.6 days. One ship every 4 days." He read it twice. Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic by 1943. Now he understood why. You could sink 100 Liberty ships, and the Americans would build 100 more. He turned the page, a smiling woman in coveralls welding a hull plate. Another caption, "Rosie the Riveter keeps the fleet afloat." They had slogans, they had faith, and more importantly, they had capacity. The guard called lights out. Hans closed the magazine slowly, like closing a casket. The next morning, a young POW named Dieter asked, "Do you think we ever had a chance?" Hans didn't answer right away. He looked toward the rising sun, the flag flapping above the guard post, the fresh supply truck arriving with more bread and jam than they could eat in a week. "No," Hans said at last. "We never had a chance." It was March 1945, and the wind over Aliceville carried the first hints of spring. Hans Keller sat beneath a blooming dogwood, its white petals drifting like ash. He no longer kept track of the days. Somewhere beyond the wire, the war was ending, not in dramatic final battles, but in the slow suffocation of a regime that had believed discipline could outrun production. One morning, a U.S. guard named Mason brought news. They crossed the Rhine. Patton, Monty, everybody. "We're inside Germany now." Hans said nothing, but he felt the world tilt. The Rhine was no ordinary river. For Germans, it was a spiritual border. The last natural wall. They had promised the Allies would never cross it. Now they had, in trucks, with bridges they built in hours, with fuel lines stretched like veins across nations. At chow that evening, the camp radios played Eisenhower's voice, clear, resolute. We are destroying the German war machine. The end is near around Hans. Some prisoners stared at the floor. Others stared at nothing. That night, in the barracks, Hans dreamed of his hometown near Cologne. Not of marching parades or family dinners, but of chimneys cold from lack of coal, of neighbors whispering in ration lines, of a once proud street now cratered by bombs dropped from planes he now knew had been built by the thousands in California, Michigan, and Kansas. The next day brought a new assignment, loading captured Luftwaffe equipment onto rail cars. Hans ran his hand across the battered fuselage of a downed Focke-Wulf FW-190. It had once ruled the skies over Europe, but now its skin was scorched, its wings clipped, its engine silent. In a hangar nearby stood 3 P-51 Mustangs, gleaming, freshly painted, still warm from factory packing grease. Each had a kill tally stenciled on its fuselage. Keller read the names: Red Fury, Liberty Bell, Chattanooga Kiss. The American officer overseeing the depot, Captain Bill Harding, gestured at the Mustangs. Those got assembled last month. 2 came from the Dallas plant, 1 from Inglewood. We've got 4 more inbound. Hans was stunned. Germany had spent years refining the FW-190. By 1945, they couldn't produce enough to replace losses. And here stood planes not even a month old, already combat ready. Captain Harding walked beside him. "You know what your mistake was?" he asked, not unkindly. "You thought war was won with will, but we knew it was won with logistics." Keller didn't argue, because it was true. By the time Roosevelt died in April and the American flag was raised over the Elbe, Hans felt no defiance, only awe. The Reich had built ideology. America had built infrastructure. In May, news arrived. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional. The camp chapel filled with stunned silence. The guards did not cheer. They lowered the flag to half-mast for Roosevelt, who had died just weeks before victory. The chaplain's voice broke when he prayed. That night, Keller walked past the camp library and saw a new photo on the wall. It showed an American supply convoy stretching for miles across the German countryside. Jeeps, trucks, tankers, mobile kitchens, and bulldozers, all moving east. The caption read, "Operation Overwhelming." He didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things they had believed, that precision could overcome quantity, that sacrifice could replace scale, that purity of purpose could substitute for boots, fuel, and bread. But in the end, what defeated Germany wasn't just bombs or bullets. It was the unrelenting hum of factories, the rhythm of trains that never stopped, the idea that no man would go without socks, bullets, or chocolate, not because of ideology, but because of design. And as the sun rose over Aliceville, warm and golden, Hans Keller understood that he had not just witnessed a war. He had witnessed the unmaking of an empire. The day the repatriation orders came, Hans Keller stood in line beneath a pale Alabama sky. He clutched a slip of paper stamped with his name and a train assignment. No fanfare, no final salute. Just a one-way ride back to the ruins of a homeland that no longer existed. Before departure, the camp guards gave each prisoner a care package: socks, cigarettes, a toothbrush, chocolate, and a letter from the U.S. government promising humane treatment for all returning POWs. Keller held the package like it was fragile. Inside was more than he'd had in his pack during 3 years of war. The train pulled out of Aliceville just after sunrise. As it rattled east, Hans stared out the window, passing endless fields, power lines, silos, and water towers. Towns pulsed with traffic. Warehouses bustled. Grain elevators stood like monuments. Even the junkyards brimmed with discarded machines, still more advanced than anything Germany had built by war's end. Outside Cincinnati, the train slowed. A massive factory complex rolled into view. Rows of smokestacks, train spurs, and loading docks. An industrial city within a city. A sign arched over the gate: Curtiss Wright Propeller Division. Hans blinked. He'd read about this place. At its peak, the plant had turned out 146,000 propellers in a single year. That was more than the Luftwaffe's total aircraft output. Not just a factory, an empire of motion. Further east, they passed through Pittsburgh. Steel mills belched smoke into the sky, casting red glows on the Ohio River. A conductor explained that over 30 million tons of steel had been produced in 1944 alone, more than the entire Axis combined. Hans sat back, quiet. These weren't just numbers. They were gravestones for an ideology. He arrived in New York Harbor 2 days later, and as the ferry took him toward the transport ship, the skyline rose like a verdict. The Statue of Liberty stood tall in the morning mist, copper green and unmoved. Beyond it, piers stretched into the river like fingers reaching across the world. Beside him stood another prisoner, Klaus, who whispered, "We fought the wrong war." Hans didn't answer. He couldn't. He turned back toward the ship and spotted something on the dock, a tower of wooden crates. Stenciled labels read, "Rations, Pacific Theater." Even now, months after Germany's surrender, the U.S. war machine was still running, preparing for the final push against Japan. There was no pause, no fatigue, just momentum. Before boarding, Hans looked back at the skyline one last time. The Empire State Building, Brooklyn Bridge, rail yards, cranes, ships, a civilization built not just to fight wars, but to end them. The ship's engine rumbled. As it pulled away, he felt the hum of its turbines deep in his chest. American-made, like everything else. Precision-welded, mass-produced, limitless. Keller stood at the rail and watched the land shrink behind him. He thought of his father's warnings, of Goebbels' speeches, of the years they believed they were destined to rule. But history had chosen its victor, not by ideology or bloodline, but by capacity. This was not a war of glory. It was a war of logistics, of rail cars and tank tread patterns, of spark plugs and supply chains. And in that war, America had been not a nation, but a machine. A machine powered not by conquest, but by conviction. As the harbor faded into horizon, Hans Keller whispered the only truth that still held meaning. They didn't just defeat us. They outbuilt us.